The snow-covered mansion stood like a beacon in the quiet winter night, glowing with opulence and cheer. Inside, the party was a spectacle of wealth. Gleaming chandeliers, flowing champagne, and a tree so large it seemed to pierce the vaulted ceiling. But outside, Officer Brad Daniels's sharp eyes locked onto the sleek black SUV pulling into the driveway. Something about the vehicle made him bristle. Daniels adjusted his gloves as his breath puffed out into the cold night air. The SUV rolled to a stop, its tinted windows catching the glow of the estate's golden lights. His fingers brushed the radio on his shoulder as he muttered, "Doesn't look like they belong here." Inside, the warmth of the party was palpable. A string quartet played soft carols in the background, blending perfectly with the cheerful hum of guests chatting over crystal glasses. Men in tailored tuxedos exchanged knowing smiles, while women in dazzling gowns glittered under the chandelier's light. The grand Christmas tree stood proudly at the center of the hall, its branches laden with ornaments that likely cost more than some people's cars. Mm, 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 The grand Christmas trees plugged into the hall to shape like skeletons from the Christmas tree hen. Waitstaff floated through the room with trays of delicacies that looked too perfect to eat, offering smiles as polished as the silver platters they carried. The scent of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts mingled with the faint aroma of fresh pine and expensive cologne. Everything about the party screamed exclusivity, a world designed for the elite. Yet, as the black SUV's doors opened and the family emerged, Daniels's unease grew. He couldn't put his finger on why, but something about them didn't sit right. "Let's see what they're up to," he murmured, his jaw tightening as he took a step closer to the entrance. The snow glistened under the sharp glow of streetlights as Officer Brad Daniels shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the frosted gravel. It had been a quiet night so far, the kind of routine shift that both bored him and gave him a sense of control. But, as his gaze swept over the mansion's brightly lit driveway, his eyes locked onto a sleek black SUV slowly pulling in. Uh-huh. Daniel stiffened, his gut tightening. The car didn't match the flashy luxury vehicles that had paraded through the gates all evening. Its tinted windows reflected the golden lights of the estate, concealing its passengers. "What do we have here?" he muttered, brushing his hand over the radio clipped to his shoulder. Inside the party, the festive cheer reached a crescendo. A massive Christmas tree stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, its branches weighed down by shimmering ornaments and twinkling lights. Guests in tailored tuxedos and glittering gowns filled the grand hall, their laughter blending with the gentle strains of a string quartet playing Silent Night. Waitstaff glided silently through the crowd, offering trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres that looked like edible works of art. The atmosphere radiated wealth and exclusivity, a place where power moved quietly behind polite smiles and firm handshakes. But, outside, Daniels's focus remained fixed on the SUV as its doors opened. A family stepped out, their polished appearance setting them apart from the crowd of elites. Daniels's frown deepened. Families like that didn't belong here, or so he thought. I was trying to get her to leave, but she lingered. "I've had what I need," she said, with careful enforcement, as he took in the landscape. Adjusting his gloves, Daniels muttered under his breath, "Let's see what you're up to." His boots crunched against the gravel as he took a step closer, his mind already racing with assumptions. The black SUV gleamed under the soft glow of the mansion's golden lights as its doors swung open. The first to step out was James Carter, a man whose presence exuded quiet authority. Dressed in a tailored burgundy suit with a pocket square that matched the deep tones of the season, James adjusted his tie with practiced ease. His warm brown eyes scanned the towering estate before landing on his wife, who emerged from the car with a grace that turned heads wherever she went. Grace Carter was the picture of holiday elegance. Her emerald green gown flowed like liquid silk, catching the soft light with every step. A simple pearl necklace adorned her neck, accentuating her poised demeanor. She knelt slightly to fix the scarf of her youngest child, her smile warm and reassuring. Her presence wasn't just elegant, it was magnetic, a blend of confidence and kindness that put everyone at ease. Grace and Mabel both looked at me with gentleness that put me at ease. Is that the biggest tree in the world? Mia Carter, the couple's 8-year-old daughter, asked, her voice tinged with awe. Her wide eyes were fixed on the towering Christmas tree visible through the grand windows of the mansion. The twinkling lights reflected in her gaze as she clutched a small stuffed reindeer, a treasure she insisted on bringing to every festive event. Nia seemed unaffected by the beauty of the moment. Dressed in a red velvet dress trimmed with white fur, Mia looked every bit the image of childlike holiday joy. Her excitement was infectious as she tugged at her father's hand. "Daddy, are there going to be presents under that tree?" James chuckled, patting her hand gently. "Maybe for good little girls who behave themselves tonight," he said, winking at her. James said nothing but just continued to press on Travis' senses. Behind her, Ethan Carter, her 12-year-old brother, adjusted the cuffs of his navy blazer with the practiced unease of a boy unused to formal attire. "Do we have to stay long?" he asked, his tone hovering somewhere between curiosity and reluctance. The tie around his neck looked just a little too tight for his liking, and he tugged at it again with a grimace. "You'll survive," Grace said, her voice light with humor as she ruffled his neatly combed hair. Ethan huffed but smiled despite himself, the excitement of the evening outweighing his discomfort. The Carters weren't just an ordinary family. They carried an authenticity that set them apart. Their holiday spirit wasn't performative, it was genuine, visible in the way they exchanged smiles, teased one another, and marveled at the grandeur around them. As they approached the entrance, James offered his arm to Grace, who accepted it with a quiet laugh. The doorman greeted them warmly, and the family paused for a moment to take it all in. "This is going to be a night to remember," James said softly, his gaze sweeping over the glowing mansion. With Grace by his side and their children skipping ahead in excitement, it was hard not to believe him. Officer Brad Daniels stood near the edge of the mansion's sprawling driveway, his hands resting firmly on his belt. The bitter chill of the night stung his face, but he barely noticed, his sharp gaze sweeping over the arriving guests. Daniels had been on security detail at events like this before, and they always left a bitter taste in his mouth. Then, the two of them sat around a table, and Billy, despite the cold of the night and the excess heat in her vagina, she grabbed her mug and smiled, up to go in turn. Wealthy elites gliding out of luxury cars and into their gilded gatherings, he thought with a sneer. They treated officers like him as invisible, just part of the decor meant to ensure their precious peace wasn't disturbed. To them, Daniel shifted his weight, his boots crunching on the frosted gravel, as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the entrance. His eyes narrowed. Unlike the ostentatious Rolls-Royces and Bentleys that had paraded through all evening, this car was understated but polished, its tinted windows glinting under the estate's golden lights. Something about it put him on edge. The doors opened and a family stepped out. Daniel straightened instinctively, his brow furrowing as he watched them. The man in the tailored suit carried himself with a confidence Daniels didn't like. Calm, self-assured, unbothered. His wife, dressed in an elegant gown, was the picture of composure, her every movement graceful. The two children bounced with excitement, pointing toward the mansion's massive Christmas tree visible through the windows. "You got enough for everything." Daniels's jaw tightened. He couldn't explain it, but something about them didn't sit right. Maybe it was the ease with which they moved toward the entrance, as though they belonged. Or maybe it was the way the man smiled at the doorman, exchanging pleasantries without a trace of nervousness. "They don't look like the kind of people who get invited to parties like this," Daniels muttered under his breath. His gloved hand brushed the radio clip to his shoulder, an unconscious habit that seemed to ground him in moments of suspicion. The guests ahead of the family were predictable, wealthy couples in designer attire, laughing and posing for photos like they were at the Oscars. But this family didn't fit the mold. At least, not in Daniels's eyes. His mind raced, filling in gaps with assumptions. Maybe they'd slipped past security, or maybe they were here to make trouble. Daniel stepped closer, his sharp gaze locked on the family as they reached the entrance. The man, the father, exchanged a few words with the host and handed over their invitation. The doorman nodded with a smile, ushering them inside without hesitation. Daniel's irritation flared. Probably fake, he muttered, his boots crunching as he moved toward the main door. His pulse quickened. Though there was no logical reason for it, years of patrolling had taught him one thing. People like that didn't just show up at places like this without a reason. "Let's see what you're up to," Daniel said under his breath, his hand brushing against his radio again. He adjusted his cap, his gaze never leaving the family as they disappeared into the glowing interior. Daniels wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he was certain he'd find it. The Carters had barely settled into the glow of the mansion's grand hall when Officer Brad Daniels approached, his boots echoing against the marble floor. His presence stood out starkly against the festive atmosphere. The guests were all smiles and champagne, but Daniels's expression was anything but friendly. His sharp eyes locked onto James Carter as though he were a target. Excuse me," Daniels said, his tone curt, drawing the attention of nearby guests. The conversations around them softened to a murmur. "Can I see some identification?" James turned toward Daniels, momentarily surprised, but quickly composed himself. "Good evening, officer," he said with a polite smile. "Identification? I believe the invitation we handed to the doorman should suffice." Daniels's eyes narrowed. "It's standard procedure for security to ensure all attendees belong here," he replied, his voice firm. He glanced briefly at Grace, then at the children, his gaze lingering on Mia's stuffed reindeer before returning to James. Daniels ran on with his filled life. Class bosses recognized him as a talented daughter. James reached into his jacket pocket and produced his wallet with deliberate calm. He held out his driver's license. "Here you go," he said, his tone measured. "And for the record, we were invited by the host." As James put on his wallet, and with some agility and thoroughness, he took both of his umbrellas and pulled them over his head. The chief of police said. The lights went down. Daniels took the license but barely glanced at it, his focus remaining on James. "Mind telling me what brings you here tonight?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Grace, standing just behind James, stepped forward slightly, her brows knitting in confusion. "We're here to celebrate Christmas," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Just like everyone else?" Daniels muttered, his eyes flicking back to James. "Pretty exclusive event. Must be nice to have connections." James's smile tightened, but his tone remained steady. "It is. I'm fortunate to work with people who value my contributions to the community." The response was calm but pointed, and Daniels seemed momentarily thrown off. He shifted his stance, glancing around the room. A few guests nearby had stopped to watch, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Mia clung to Grace's hand, her wide eyes darting between the officer and her father. Ethan stood stiffly, his jaw tightening as he watched the interaction unfold. "Is there a problem, officer?" James asked, his tone polite, but with a subtle edge. Daniels took a half-step closer, lowering his voice. "Just making sure everything's in order," he said, though his tone carried more accusation than assurance. "Wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Grace's voice cut through the tension, warm but firm. "We've shown you everything you asked for, officer. Is there anything else?" Daniels glanced down at the license still in his hand, as if searching for an excuse to prolong the interaction. Finally, he handed it back, his expression unreadable. "Not for now," he said, though his voice hinted that this wasn't over. As Daniels stepped back, the family exchanged a glance, their smiles dimmed but not extinguished. Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the room, subtle but telling. The officer's presence had disrupted the holiday cheer, leaving a chill in its wake. And the festive hum of the party was fading, replaced by the uneasy murmurs of nearby guests. Officer Daniels stood rigid, his posture like a coiled spring as he faced the Carters. His eyes flicked to the elegant crowd around them, then back to James, his expression hardening. You're going to need to show me that invitation, Daniel said flatly, crossing his arms over his chest. James tilted his head, keeping his tone measured. Officer, as I mentioned, we handed the invitation to the doorman when we arrived. If there's an issue, I'm happy to clear it up with the host. Daniel shook his head, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. I'm not asking the host. I'm asking you. If you're supposed to be here, you should have no problem proving it. Grace stepped forward, her emerald gown shimmering under the glow of the chandeliers. We're guests, officer, she said gently, though there was steel beneath her words. Surely there's no need to make a scene. Daniels's jaw tightened. I'm not making a scene, he said sharply, his voice cutting through the murmurs around them. Just doing my job. And my job is to make sure people aren't slipping in where they don't belong. Ethan stepped closer to his father, his fists clenched at his sides. Dad, what's going on? He whispered. Okay. James placed a calming hand on his son's shoulder. It's okay, Ethan, he said, though his gaze didn't leave Daniel's. We'll sort this out. I'm waiting, Daniel said, tapping his fingers against his belt. James inhaled deeply, pulling out his phone. Fine. I'll call the host directly. His voice remained calm, but there was an undercurrent of frustration. Okay. Daniels leaned slightly forward, his smirk returning. Why would you need to call the host? Shouldn't you have the invitation on you? I told you, James said evenly, scrolling through his phone. The invitation was handed over at the entrance, as per standard procedure. This should clear everything up. Before James could dial, Daniels reached out, gesturing sharply. Put the phone away. I don't need to speak to anyone else. I'm asking you directly. What's your business here? Grace's warm demeanor began to crack, her brow furrowing. Officer, you're harassing us for no reason. We've been nothing but cooperative. Daniels's voice rose, a sharp edge cutting through the air. I'm not harassing anyone. If you're supposed to be here, just prove it. Or are you having trouble because you're not on the guest list? The accusation hung heavy in the air, and a collective gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. The guests who had been pretending not to notice were now openly watching, their faces a mix of shock and unease. Mia clutched her stuffed reindeer tighter, her lip trembling. Mommy, why is he yelling? Grace crouched down, brushing her daughter's cheek with a soothing hand. It's all right, sweetheart, she said softly, though her eyes burned with indignation. James's patience was wearing thin. He straightened, his voice firm but restrained. Officer, I don't know what you're trying to imply, but my family and I have every right to be here. If you have any doubts, I suggest you take it up with the host. Daniel stepped closer, towering over James. What I'm implying, he said, his tone dripping with disdain, is that people like you don't just waltz into places like this without raising questions. The words landed like a slap. Grace straightened, her hands tightening at her sides, while Ethan took an instinctive step back, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. James's expression darkened, but he didn't rise to the bait. People like us? Grace said quietly, her voice trembling with restrained fury. Daniels didn't answer, but the smug look in his eyes said enough. The tension was palpable now, the room's once festive air replaced with an icy silence. You're out of line, James said finally, his voice steady but cold. Am I? Daniel shot back, his voice rising. You're the one who can't even prove you were invited. What am I supposed to think? His face hollowed out and his physics shook. A guest nearby cleared her throat, stepping hesitantly forward. Officer, I believe this is unnecessary, she said, her tone nervous. The Carters are friends of the host. I'm sure there's no issue here. Daniels barely glanced at her, his focus locked on James. I don't need someone else vouching for them, he snapped. If they're legitimate, they can prove it themselves. What does legitimate mean? Enough, Grace said firmly, stepping between Daniels and her husband. You're upsetting my children, and I won't allow it. Her voice carried an authority that caught Daniels off guard, but he quickly masked his surprise with a sneer. Then cooperate, he said, though the words sounded weaker now, faltering under the weight of the crowd's growing scrutiny. James placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, a silent gesture to steady her. This ends now, officer, he said quietly. You're embarrassing yourself. Daniels's face darkened, but before he could respond, a ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Someone had noticed the host approaching, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion as he pushed through the gathering. The tension in the room had reached its breaking point. Daniels's voice cut through the festive music, loud and grating as he gestured toward the door. That's it. If you can't provide proof, you're leaving. Now. James's jaw tightened, his calm composure wavering ever so slightly. He placed a protective hand on Mia's shoulder, who looked up at him with wide, tearful eyes. Daddy, are we in trouble? She whispered, clutching her stuffed reindeer. No, sweetheart, James said softly, his voice steadied despite the storm brewing around them. He turned his gaze to Daniels, his expression a mix of quiet fury and restraint. This isn't necessary, officer. We've done nothing wrong. First of all, I want my certificate to hire, and I want to retire from the military. This isn't necessary, officer. We've done nothing wrong. Then prove it, Daniels barked, stepping forward. The officer's aggressive stance and raised voice caused the guests nearby to recoil, their murmurs growing louder. Still, none of them stepped in, their discomfort palpable, but their actions non-existent. Grace knelt beside Mia, pulling her daughter close and stroking her hair. It's okay, baby, she said gently, though her voice carried a tremor of indignation. Her eyes darted to Ethan, who stood frozen, his face pale as he clung to his father's side. So many plans today. I really don't feel like taking any more. Daniels jabbed a finger toward the door. You've got two options. Leave quietly or be escorted out. Take your pick. A ripple of shock swept through the crowd, but no one dared to confront the officer. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves as the scene unfolded. Grace straightened, her emerald gown shimmering as she faced Daniel's head-on. You're upsetting my children, officer, she said, her voice firm and unyielding. Is that really the image you want to project tonight? She added. Daniel smirked, his gaze darting to the watching guests. You brought this on yourselves, he said, taking a step closer. Now, I'm not going to ask again. Lee opened his eyes for a second. James drew a deep breath, his hand tightening briefly on Ethan's shoulder. We'll leave, he said finally, his voice even but carrying the weight of his anger. This isn't worth distressing my family further, he added. I keep blaming you, but we both chose to do this. I'm sure we could all have found a way. As the Carters began to move toward the door, Daniels followed closely, his presence looming over them like a shadow. The children walked with their heads low, Mia holding her stuffed reindeer tightly against her chest. Ethan glanced back at the crowd, his face a mixture of fear and confusion, as he searched for a friendly face among the onlookers. But no one stepped forward. The murmurs grew louder as Daniels reached out to nudge James's back, urging him forward. Keep moving, he said sharply, his tone dismissive. Mia began to cry softly, the sound piercing through the festive air. Grace stopped, crouching to wipe her daughter's tears. It's all right, darling, she whispered, though her own voice trembled. We're leaving now. James turned to Daniels one last time, his eyes blazing. "You've made your point, officer, but this isn't over." Daniels snorted, crossing his arms as the family stepped out into the cold night. Behind them, the murmurs of the crowd turned into whispers of shame, though still, no one moved to help. The heavy double doors closed behind the Carters, leaving the warmth of the mansion behind. For the family, the bitter chill of the winter air seemed more welcoming than the room they had just been forced out of. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder as the Carters disappeared down the driveway. Guests whispered furiously, some glancing toward the grand doors, where Officer Daniels still stood, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. But the festive warmth of the party had soured, replaced with a growing sense of unease. Near the Christmas tree, a middle-aged woman in a sequined navy gown lowered her champagne flute, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Wait a second," she said, her voice carrying over the low chatter. "Wasn't that James Carter?" Yeah, probably," he said. "Wise plaguin' on, oh Carter." Her companion, a distinguished man with salt and pepper hair, turned to her. "James Carter?" he repeated. "Yes," she replied, urgency creeping into her tone. "James Carter, the mayor." Um, that was him, wasn't it? The man's eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Good God," he muttered. It was. That was Mayor Carter. The realization spread like wildfire, passing from guest to guest in ripples of shock and disbelief. "The mayor? Are you sure?" someone whispered. "Positive," the woman insisted. "I met him at the charity gala last month." As the whispers grew louder, more and more guests turned toward the entrance. The self-assured expressions on their faces melted into ones of astonishment and discomfort. A young couple standing near the buffet exchanged horrified glances. "Did that officer just throw the mayor out of his own event?" the man asked. Sorry, we just entered our table," the man said. "Oh," the woman shook her head, her voice low and disbelieving. "Not just him, his entire family." At the entrance, Daniels remained oblivious to the growing storm behind him. He leaned casually against the door frame, his smug grin unwavering as he watched the black SUV disappear into the night. "Unbelievable," Daniels muttered to himself. "They really thought they could get away with it." A voice rang out behind him, sharp and accusing. "Do you even know who that was?" Daniels turned, his grin faltering, as he faced an older man with a commanding presence. The man stepped forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "That was Mayor James Carter," he said, his voice ringing clear enough for the nearby crowd to hear. Daniels blinked, his smirk vanishing completely. "What? The mayor," the man repeated, his tone biting. "You just humiliated the mayor of this city in front of all his guests." Gasps echoed through the crowd, followed by a stunned silence. Daniels's face paled as he stood frozen in place, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "It's..." He glanced back toward the driveway, his mind racing. The confident man, the poised woman, the respectful way they'd carried themselves, it all clicked into place, too late. Behind him, the murmurs of the guests turned into a cacophony of condemnation. "How could he not know?" one woman asked, her voice dripping with scorn. "What was he thinking?" another man said, shaking his head in disbelief. Daniels took a shaky step backward, his hand brushing against the doorframe for support. The smug confidence that had driven his every move now evaporated, replaced by a gnawing dread. In that moment, Daniels realized his mistake wasn't just humiliating, it was catastrophic. As the realization of James Carter's identity swept through the crowd, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted dramatically. Gone was the uncomfortable silence that had gripped the room during the confrontation. In its place rose a tide of whispers, gasps, and incredulous murmurs. "I can't believe it," one guest said, clutching her pearl necklace. "That's the mayor. How could this happen?" "Dang," admitted the mayor. Nearby, another guest, a man in a sleek black tuxedo, clenched his jaw. "How did we let this go so far?" he muttered, his voice tinged with shame. Several guests turned their attention to Officer Daniels, who still stood near the entrance, his posture rigid and his face pale. A woman in a silver gown stepped forward, her expression sharp. "What on earth were you thinking?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Dragging out the mayor like some criminal? Disgusting." Ha! Another guest, an older man with a cane, shook his head. "This is an embarrassment to all of us. You've humiliated a family that didn't deserve it. How dare you treat them that way?" Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of their collective anger pressed down on him, and for the first time that night, he felt truly powerless. As the tension mounted around Daniels, a smaller group of guests had approached the Carters, their faces etched with regret. "Mr. Carter, please accept our deepest apologies," a woman in a red gown said, her voice trembling. "We should have spoken up sooner." Another guest, a younger man in a navy suit, nodded. "We saw what was happening, and we stayed silent. That was wrong. I'm sorry." James Carter regarded them with quiet dignity. He nodded once, his tone calm but firm. "It's not just about speaking up when you see wrong. It's about ensuring it doesn't happen again." Grace stood beside him, her arm wrapped protectively around Mia. "We appreciate words," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But remember, apologies mean little without action." Leonard sits still and waits. The wind blows through his silver hair, spreading it, and he catches it all in his shirt. The crowd around them began to shift. Where moments ago there had been unease and tension, there was now an outpouring of support. Conversations turned toward accountability, and eyes shifted from the Carters to Daniels, whose presence now felt small amidst the growing wave of condemnation. The room had fallen into an uneasy silence, the festive hum replaced by an air of reflection. James Carter stood near the towering Christmas tree, its twinkling lights casting a warm glow on his face. The crowd gathered around him, their earlier whispers replaced with a solemn attentiveness. James took a deep breath, his hand resting lightly on Mia's shoulder as she clung to her stuffed reindeer. His calm composure was laced with an undercurrent of strength, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "Tonight," he began, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd, "was supposed to be a celebration of the season, a time for unity, love, and joy. But instead, it became a painful reminder of the barriers we still face as a society." He paused, letting his words settle. His gaze swept over the faces of the guests, some filled with shame, others with quiet determination. "When my family and I arrived here tonight, we came in the spirit of celebration. We came to share in the warmth of community and the joy of Christmas. But what we encountered instead was something that far too many people experience every day: judgment, suspicion, and prejudice. When I was just a passerby at the life of Jesus Christ, someone would direct me to his church for Thanksgiving." Mia looked up at him, her wide eyes glistening with the remnants of tears. James rested a reassuring hand on her head before continuing. "The spirit of Christmas isn't about exclusion. It isn't about deciding who belongs and who doesn't. It's about compassion. It's about justice. It's about recognizing the humanity in every single person, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they look like." His voice grew firmer, his words resonating with a quiet power. "Tonight, my family was judged not for our actions, but for our appearance. And while I may have the privilege of being able to stand here and speak as your mayor, I know that there are countless others who would never have that opportunity. They would be silenced, dismissed, or worse." James's gaze shifted to Ethan, whose young face was a mixture of anger and admiration. "I think about my son, who watched his father questioned and humiliated for simply being here. I think about my daughter, who had to hear raised voices and see a side of the world that no child should ever see. He paused, his voice softening. And yet, I also think about what this moment can teach us. It can teach us that silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. It can teach us that standing by and doing nothing only allows injustice to thrive. And I just looked at a great poet. I read, I think it was Something Moaning in Laya. It was on the door here on my desk. And he wrote, "It's no doubt that silence has a place in moments of thrive." Grace stepped closer to him, her presence grounding him as he finished. But most importantly, it can teach us that we have the power to do better, the power to choose kindness over suspicion, the power to create a world where the spirit of Christmas isn't just words, it's action, forgetting bravery, forgetting spirit, forgetting luck, and forgetting all that history, forgetting yet more than words. It's just the act of spirit bringing life to the place. The crowd was utterly silent, the weight of his words pressing on each of them. A woman near the front wiped a tear from her eye, her shoulders shaking with emotion. James's voice softened as he delivered his final message. So let this moment be more than just an apology. Let it be a promise to stand up for what's right, to confront prejudice wherever we see it, and to make this world, this community, a place where everyone belongs. The message became louder, more intense, as the pronouncements reached its climax. James's voice softened as he said the words clearly and powerfully. The room erupted into applause. Not the polite clapping of earlier, but something genuine, an outpouring of support and agreement. The Carters stood together, their strength and resilience lighting up the room more brightly than any decoration. As the applause for James Carter's speech began to fade, the room's collective attention shifted to Officer Daniels, who stood awkwardly near the back of the hall. The once confident officer now looked out of place, his rigid stance betraying the unease that had crept into his demeanor. He glanced around, his gaze darting between the disapproving faces of the guests and the stone-faced party host, Richard Preston, who approached him with deliberate steps. A light switched on the wall that moved the buttons on a dial pointed, and Richard Preston, who approached the buttons himself, and pointed the light directly into the microphone at the front of the stage, his eyes riveted on something. As the applause for James Carter led up, a small group of New Yorkers in the crowd saw them erupt into confusion. "Cut! Fuck! Then, late, somebody threw me out last night. I have a bite news to report about Mr. Casango and the fact that I am Daniels," Preston began, his voice low but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had clearly had enough. "You owe this man and his family a direct apology. Right now." Are you worried about getting fired?" Uh, his family members are, degraded for the game. Right now. Hey, uh, Daniel stiffened, his face flushing. "I was just doing my job," he muttered defensively, though his voice lacked the bravado it had carried earlier. "They couldn't prove they were invited. I followed procedure." "What do you mean, procedure?" Preston interrupted sharply, his voice rising just enough to cut through Daniel's excuses. "Your procedure was to drag an invited guest, our mayor, and his family out into the cold in front of everyone." The room murmured in agreement, and Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain control of the conversation. "I didn't know who he was," he snapped, his tone turning defensive. "If they had just cooperated." "Enough," Preston said, his tone biting. "This has nothing to do with their cooperation. This is about you making assumptions. You humiliated not only them, but yourself, this event, and everyone who stood by and watched." A few guests nodded, their earlier discomfort turning into open disdain for Daniels. Daniels's jaw clenched, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Look," he said, his voice rising slightly, "I thought something was off. I've been on details like this before, and you get a sense for when people don't fit." Preston's eyes widened in disbelief, and his hand shot up to silence him. "When people don't fit," he repeated, his voice laced with anger. "Do you even hear yourself? You're not defending yourself. You're digging your own grave." Um, Behind Preston, a few other guests stepped forward, their expressions stern. "Officer," one man said, his voice calm but resolute, "your actions tonight were inexcusable. You didn't just embarrass the Carters, you embarrassed this entire gathering." Another woman added, "If you had even bothered to listen to them or verify their identity properly, this wouldn't have happened, but you chose to escalate instead." What I added, Crittened escalated because it led me to not understand my emotions. Daniels's shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of their words bore down on him. "I made a mistake," he said finally, though his tone lacked sincerity. "I didn't mean for things to get this far." "Mistakes have consequences," Preston shot back, "and your actions tonight will not go unchecked." Preston turned to one of his staff members standing nearby. "Contact his supervisor immediately," he said curtly. "I want a full report on this incident sent to the precinct and the mayor's office by tomorrow morning." Daniels's face paled as he realized the full gravity of the situation. He opened his mouth to protest, but was met with a glare that silenced him. "You're done here," Preston said, his tone final. "Leave this property immediately." As Daniels turned and walked toward the exit, the eyes of the crowd followed him, their expressions a mixture of anger and disappointment. For the first time that night, Daniels felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, a sharp reminder that the authority he had so carelessly wielded had its limits. Outside, the cold night air bit at his face as he stepped onto the snow-covered driveway. Behind him, the sounds of the party began to return. Soft music, murmured conversations, and the occasional clink of glasses. Daniels didn't look back. As the door closed behind Officer Daniels, the tension in the grand hall began to ease. The guests collectively exhaled, their disapproval of his actions giving way to a sense of shared responsibility. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the gentle strains of the string quartet resuming their music. Richard Preston, the host, turned to James Carter and his family, his expression heavy with regret. "James, Grace," he said, stepping closer, "I cannot apologize enough for what you've been through tonight. It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for not stepping in sooner." James offered a polite nod, his composure steady as always. "Thank you, Richard," he replied. "Your words mean a lot, but this isn't just about my family. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." Preston's face tightened with resolve. "You're absolutely right, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure of it." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying a newfound conviction. "What happened tonight was not just the fault of one officer. It's a reflection of the biases and assumptions that still exist in our society. We owe it to ourselves to confront those biases and do better." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. One by one, guests began stepping forward to approach the Carters, their faces a mixture of shame and determination. The older woman who had earlier apologized clasped her hands tightly in front of her. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I am deeply sorry for not speaking up sooner. I was wrong to stay silent. You and your family deserved better." A younger man chimed in, "She's right. We all should have done more. Watching and doing nothing only made it worse. I promise I won't make that mistake again." He made a finger-pointing gesture as if to insult this whole circumstance around him, or at least to use the show as an example. But it's tough because, why waste all of this music? Grace, her hand resting gently on Mia's shoulder, offered a soft smile. "Acknowledging that is the first step," she said, her voice kind but firm. "It's what you do moving forward that matters most." Another guest, a man in his 40s with a firm handshake and a determined expression, approached James. "I've admired your work as mayor for years," he said, "and I'd like to help. If there's anything I can do, whether it's organizing events or supporting policies that address these systemic issues, you can count on me." James broke away from the confusion. His gaze was sliding toward the pallet behind him. "Since you're being pretty lame." James extended his hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you," he said. "Change takes all of us, working together." The guests nodded, a sense of solidarity forming in the room. Conversations turned to pledges of action, supporting initiatives for police accountability, engaging in bias training, and fostering community programs that promoted inclusivity. Preston gestured toward the party center. "Please, James, Grace, Mia, Ethan, come back inside. This celebration is as much yours as anyone else's. Let us make it right." Grace exchanged a glance with James and they both nodded. "We'd like that," James said, his tone warm. The Carters stepped back into the heart of the party, their presence now met with genuine warmth and respect. Guests surrounded them, not out of obligation, but with a shared understanding of the evening's lessons. Mia looked up at her mother, her wide eyes brightening for the first time since the confrontation. "Does this mean we can have some cookies now?" she asked. Yeah. Grace chuckled softly, brushing a hand over Mia's curls. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's enjoy the party." The quartet transitioned into a lively Christmas melody as laughter and conversation gradually returned. But this time, the joy was deeper, more meaningful, rooted in reflection and a collective commitment to change. Auntie. By the next morning, the events of the Christmas party had made headlines across the city. A video recorded by one of the guests showing Officer Daniels forcibly removing the Carter family from the mansion had gone viral overnight. The footage captured every painful moment, the officer's harsh tone, James's calm composure, and the tearful faces of Mia and Ethan. The accompanying captions and hashtags, "Justice for the Carters," "End Bias," and "Accountability Now," sparked immediate property damage. News anchors discussed the incident with visible disapproval, replaying the clip alongside James Carter's speech. "This isn't just about one family or one officer," one anchor stated. "This is a glaring example of how systemic biases continue to affect even those in positions of power. If this can happen to a mayor, what does it say about the experiences of ordinary citizens?" Yeah. I just think that's a great story, dude. I love the biases continue. Do you know, I forgot what the guy's name is. The police department, already under scrutiny for other controversies, found itself in the center of a media storm. Within hours, the chief of police held a press conference to address the issue. Standing behind a podium flanked by department officials, she spoke with measured urgency. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Daniels at last night's event," she began, her tone firm. "Let me be clear. The actions displayed in that footage do not reflect the values or standards of our department. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation." Questions from reporters came fast and relentless. "Chief, will Officer Daniels be terminated? How does the department plan to address the systemic issues highlighted by this incident? Does the department acknowledge racial bias played a role here?" The chief sighed, her hands gripping the sides of the podium. "This department is committed to accountability," she replied. "We are taking immediate steps to review our training and protocols, including mandatory bias training for all officers. Beyond that, we will cooperate fully with any external investigations into this matter." Meanwhile, the Carter family became the focus of national attention. James Carter's poised but powerful response during the party, coupled with the dignity his family displayed throughout the ordeal, struck a chord with people across the country. News outlets reached out to him for interviews, and his name became synonymous with calls for change. Oh, my fiance is like, we need to use this moment to spark meaningful dialogue, James said during one televised interview. This isn't about vilifying one officer. It's about addressing a system that allows these incidents to happen in the first place. As public pressure mounted, the department's internal investigation moved quickly. Within a week, the results were announced. Officer Daniels was officially terminated for conduct unbecoming of an officer. A public statement from the department acknowledged the role of implicit bias in the incident and promised further reforms. While some in the community viewed Daniels' firing as a step toward justice, others emphasized that the conversation could not end there. Rallies and town hall meetings sprang up, with citizens sharing their own stories of prejudice and demanding broader reforms. For the Carters, the weeks that followed were a whirlwind of advocacy. James used the momentum to promote policies focused on police accountability and equity. "We cannot change the past," he said at one rally, "but we can shape the future. Together." The incident at the Christmas party had become more than just a personal affront to James Carter and his family. It became a catalyst for change. Over the following weeks, James used the platform thrust upon him to advocate for unity, justice, and the dismantling of systemic bias. In town hall meetings and interviews, James remained composed but passionate. "What happened to my family is not an isolated incident," he often began. "It's a symptom of a larger issue, one we must address together as a community." His speeches resonated deeply, sparking conversations that were long overdue. James partnered with local advocacy groups to draft reforms aimed at increasing police accountability and improving community police relations. These included mandatory bias training for officers, transparent disciplinary measures for misconduct, and the creation of a civilian oversight committee to handle complaints. The proposals gained traction quickly, with residents rallying behind the mayor's vision for a fairer, more inclusive city. 157 Grace played her part too, using her warmth and empathy to engage with mothers, educators, and community leaders. She shared their family's experience, emphasizing the importance of raising children in a world where justice and equality were not just ideals, but realities. And Margaret, I meant to say, this is definitely not one of my favorite segments of the show. Jamie definitely comes close, I think. Even Ethan and Mia contributed in their own way. Ethan wrote an essay about his perspective on the night of the party, which was published in the local paper. "That night, I learned that standing up for what's right isn't just something you do when it's easy," he wrote. "It's something you do because it matters." Despite the whirlwind of public appearances and policy discussions, the Carters made time for each other. It was Grace who reminded James that real change began at home. "You've done so much good already," she said one evening as they sat by their Christmas tree. "But don't forget, James, the greatest example you can set is for our children." Her words stayed with him. A few nights later, the family returned to the mansion for a smaller, more intimate gathering organized by Richard Preston. This time, the atmosphere was different. Guests who had once stood by silently now approached the Carters with genuine warmth and solidarity. "We're so glad you came back," Preston said, greeting them at the door. "Tonight's about celebration, but it's also about reflection. You've inspired us all to be better." Inside, the halls were alive with music and laughter, but the joy felt deeper, more meaningful. The Carters mingled with other guests, their interactions marked by newfound respect and understanding. Mia's giggles echoed as she admired the ornaments on the towering Christmas tree, while Ethan chatted animatedly with a group of adults about his essays. Later, as the family stood together near the glowing tree, James took a moment to reflect. He watched Grace laugh softly as she adjusted Mia's scarf, and Ethan proudly show his essay to a small group of guests. In their faces, he saw hope, the same hope that had carried him through every challenge and inspired him to keep fighting for a better world. "We've come a long way," James said quietly, his voice steady. Grace smiled, slipping her hand into his. And we're just getting started. The family stood together, framed by the twinkling lights of the tree and the warmth of the room, a picture of resilience and unity. For the Carters, the season had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't just about celebrating Christmas. It was about embodying its true spirit: love, justice, and the power of coming together to create lasting change.